Hi. As we move into our next section, 1 Samuel 11 to 15, I thought it was important that we stop and do a little overview of these chapters before we begin to launch into each chapter and story in detail. Because readers who've never read this section before, who haven't grappled with the scholarly discourse around these chapters, may find themselves caught in a confusing web of cross intentions and mixed signals and wonder what the heck is going on here. And I don't expect that we're going to come up with answers. We'll end up with more questions than answers. We may even end up more confused than clarified by the time we're done with this. And I want to suggest that despite the range of ways scholars approach this, that the confusion and the crossing viewpoints and even the paradoxes is a feature, not a bug, of how Samuel was constructed here. Because the question of monarchy and the question of Saul in particular was not one that everybody agreed upon, and the question of Yahweh's role in it was also not one that everybody agreed upon. So whether, as we've been looking at throughout our study of the book of Samuel, whether we see this as a function of multiple conflicting voices from different time periods that wrote on top of each other and edited each other into the final version, or perhaps of differing viewpoints at the very same moment, as anybody who lives in any society knows that whether, as I write for the United States in 2022, as I'm making this video, it's hardly like all Americans see the question of democracy and particular participants in the political system the same way. And I'm sure that's true in virtually every culture. In fact, as I'm doing this video, there are at least 4 countries that are facing the ousters of their prime ministers whilst I write in this particular moment. So it should not surprise us that a culture writing its memory of history of monarchy would not have a consistent view. So I want to start with quotes from a couple scholars whose work has helped me in this before we try to look at some things that might give us an overview of some of the issues we're going to face. So first, from Ian Wilson here, and you can see the cover of his book, Kingship and Memory in Ancient Judah. And Wilson is working here with the sense that whatever we see in 1 Samuel is obviously not a transcript, as is clear for any scholar, and not facts, but memory filtered through ideology and time. And so after having explored much of this in detail, he concludes, or at least concludes part of his section with this quote. And I want to listen to it in detail so we can hear exactly what he's saying. So he says here, "The causes of kingship, its identity, and its ideological or theological import for Israel," notice each of those are 3 separate things, we'll come back to them, if not this video, another one, "are unclear in the narrative. The causes of kingship, its identity, and its ideological or theological import are unclear. The story's emplotment is inconsistent. This inconsistency would elicit a picture of kingship's beginnings and of the past in general that was fuzzy, a memory that was blurred and would invite many readings and considerations of political transition. As throughout the Deuteronomistic corpus," for those not familiar, that's all the books from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, "the overarching problem is failure to adhere to Torah, that is, disobedience and its consequences. But in this particular instance, one could not reconcile the precise details. Samuel and Saul's narrative is riddled with overdetermination, multiple causes, and plot lines leading to the same outcome, Israelite kingship." And then he says a couple of pages later, summarizing what we're about in these particular chapters. "A proven form of leadership, that is, judgeship under Samuel, fails on account of problems with dynasty, that is, of course, that his sons were corrupt. And the dynastic form of leadership that replaces it, kingship under Saul, fails to prove its ability to lead. Kingship's unlikely rise at judgeship's expense is matched by its immediate and unlikely fall, confirming both sides of the doublethink." And his use of the Orwellian term doublethink there, I think, is very insightful, because whether it's readers now thousands of years from the original situation and out of context, or even those who are in the immediate situation, I'm sure would find it troublesome of who, at the end of this, who thinks what and who's on whose side here, because it's not at all clear. That leads another scholar who's written a portrait of Samuel in a monograph to note this about the struggle of scholars to resolve the conflicts that Wilson points out here. And that's from Marty Stussy. So she says here, and there's her book, Samuel and His God, "Scholars make their living by disagreeing with one another and coming up with new theories. So, of course, they do not all agree on how to account for these different pictures of Saul." And perhaps that sounds a little cynical in the sense that they're just coming up with theories because they have to make a living and prove that they have a new thought. And that is true. But in addition to that, I believe that many of these scholars, of course, are authentically trying to grapple with the story. But is the question something in Saul's psychology? Is there like something wrong with the person Saul? Is it something about God's relationship with Saul? Something about Samuel's relationship with Saul? Is it not about Saul in particular? Is he a symbol of something else? And on it goes. And what's amazing at one level, but also not surprising, is I'm reading dozens of scholars on this. Each one insists that their answer is right and everybody else is wrong, much like people arguing that their religion is right and others are wrong. Fortunately, these scholars don't come with the authority of violent enforcement as churches historically or governments have if you disagree with them. But the point is that as readers here, we're faced with a dizzying array of viewpoints, and I'm obviously not going to try to present all of them. I'm going to present a few as we go along and the lines of discussion so that readers now can make sense of what a struggle it was for the ancient audience to grapple with this question of monarchy in general, but more specifically with the question of Saul. So let's turn to our passages here from these texts. We're not going to look at the actual text today because, as you can see on the right side in the black and yellow document, scenes and themes in 1 Samuel 11 to 15. The main thing I want to do in this video is go through that, pointing out some things using some of the tools we've already looked at on the left side. This one up right now is Samuel's exchanges with the people about the monarchy, but there's some others we'll go back to too. And if you haven't gone back, watch the previous videos, all of these documents are posted on the web page, and you can go back and get those even if you haven't seen them from the previous videos. So what I want to highlight here are just some of the challenges that we face so that as we go through these chapters in the upcoming videos, we can reference back to this one here and remember the touch point from which all these specific stories emerge. So first we have to recognize where we are. So at the end of chapter 10, Saul is king. But what does that mean? It's not like in the United States where you become president and there's a White House and there's a budget and there's a tradition and offices and staff and all those things. But Saul is called king. He's also called Nagid or prince. But what does that mean? He has no budget. He has no staff. He has no weapons as far as you know. He also, as far as you know, has no skills or experience. All we know about Saul is he was out chasing donkeys, and now we're going to see him plowing with oxen, and that his father is an important figure in their local hometown. But we don't know exactly what his father's role was, whether he's a rich man or a powerful a person of powerful status. We really know very little, just one word description of him. And we know even less about Saul other than the fact that he's tall, which tells us nothing whatsoever about his ability to be king. So imagine for a moment you were Saul, not looking for power, just about your life, looking for donkeys, and you come upon Samuel and he takes you under his wing or under his leash, as the case may be, and leads you around, and before you know it, they're looking for a king, and you try to hide from them, but they find you, and now, for better or for worse, you're king. As someone who worked in politics in the U.S. Senate and also in federal agency and here in Washington State in the Attorney General's office, I'm pretty aware of how politics works and what it means to seek political office. And I don't need to point out particular politicians to make the comment that I hope makes sense to most people, that anybody who'd really want a political job maybe isn't the person you want to have it. Not to say that decent people don't run for office, but certainly to be king or to be president, to be the leader, requires an enormous ego and a confidence that one is right, that people should listen to me, whoever that person is, and a desire for power. And in many indigenous cultures, in fact, it works the other way around. As I learned on a trip to Chiapas in southern Mexico, that they choose leadership the opposite way. Anybody who'd want a leadership post can't get it. It has to be chosen from the community for somebody who isn't seeking it. And Saul falls in that category here. So at that level, he's not someone who is seeking to be king. When we get to the David story, we'll see David is already out in the battle as a kid watching. He wants in on it, and he volunteers to take on Goliath, and he's ready to go. But Saul has not sought this. So now that he's been entitled with this, what does that mean? We're going to see in chapter 11, which is where we start here, and I point us to the right side of the screen, that the situation is to begin with a foreigner, Nahash the Ammonite. Notice not the Philistines, who were the original source for why the people wanted to have a king, threatened to disgrace the people of Jabesh Gilead, a town there in the wider area of Israel, by gouging out each person's right eye. And they take a 7-day respite to find if they can get a champion, and they come, as you can see in my box there, to Gibeah of Saul. We'll talk about that more when we get there, but notice the unusual thing of naming the city after the person rather than Saul of Gibeah. And all the people wept aloud. And Saul, who's coming in from leading the oxen, we're told, receives the Spirit of God, cuts up the oxen to muster volunteer soldiers to come out after Saul and Samuel. And that's our first crux. Why Samuel? if Saul's king, why would they be coming out after Saul and Samuel? Samuel has no role here. He's not been a military leader, and that's not what his power was. So there's a real question there about what's going on with Saul and Samuel. And that will lead us, and I'll bring this up now and we'll look at it more later, to the various aspects of the relation between Saul and Samuel, a contentious one indeed. And the text tells us here back in chapter 11 that 370,000 soldiers are mustered, and Saul leads them successfully to victory over the Ammonites. And of course, many questions there. Where did this large number of soldiers come from? Were they getting paid? Did they have uniforms? Did they have weapons? Who organized them? Is it just one man leading, these hundreds of thousands of soldiers? It's an incredible scene in the literal sense of incredible, especially in light of later we'll see that Saul gathers, as you can see down there in the second yellow box from 13:1 to 4, 3,000 soldiers, keeping 2,000 and leaving 1,000 of Jonathan. So that reasonable number, although still a very large number compared to 370,000, certainly suggests that the story in chapter 11 is not factually true, but it certainly leads us to wonder what are the steps between being made king and being able to gather this enormous mass of soldiers, almost the same number that are traditionally described as having left Egypt during the Exodus. So we see that first scene there. And while the people come to there, we see in the first yellow box, it says the people, which leads to another one of our questions throughout the whole thing. So I have on the left side now Samuel's exchanges with the people about the monarchy. But I want to note here is it's a slippery question of which people exactly are we talking about. So we saw back in chapter 8, as you can see in the first blue box, the elders of Israel. What seemed like a traditional group of the leadership elite in the nation. Although there hasn't been a tradition of elders of Israel, each tribe has its own tradition. If we were to read the Bible in the order that we have the books, not necessarily the order in which it was written. So we see the elders of Israel brought the initial request, but then you see next in chapter 10, it says Samuel summons the people. Which the people? Everybody? And then a little farther down in that same paragraph, you see that Saul found and said to be chosen by Yahweh from among the tribes and clans. So does the people mean all the tribes and clans, or is that some subset of that? What exactly is going on there? You see in chapter 11, the passage we're going to be looking at next here, again, Saul calls the people. But when we get to the David part in chapter 16, the last black box there on the left side down in the Bethlehem area, it says, he came to Bethlehem where the elders of the city. So not the elders of the nation, like the elders of Israel at Ramah, but the elders of a local city. So there are many issues here of whose king is this? Who's approving of the king? The phrase the people can't mean all the people throughout the land. In a world with no mass communication, there's no way a message could even get distributed that quickly, let alone have everybody leave their farms and everything else they're doing and gather in one place. So the writers are doing something to suggest there's a national consensus when, in fact, if we listen closely to the story, this is a very small story taking place in a very small piece of area, a geographic area, among a small group of people. And yet the text makes it sound like it's a national decision here. So back to our yellow box on the right side. So the people go to Samuel and demand the lives of those who resisted Saul's reign. And they go to Samuel for that, but Saul, not Samuel, answers. So again, this dance between Saul and Samuel, a question addressed to Samuel is answered by Saul, who acts in a very royal way and a very Yahwistic way by refusing their request to have anybody killed and claiming it was Yahweh who had brought deliverance to Israel. So in his first battle, he gives the glory to Yahweh and makes no credit for it himself. So far, we certainly see that Saul seems like he's on the right track, despite the elements of the story that are fantastical and don't make any kind of literal sense. But then immediately after that, something strange happened. Samuel calls the people, and this is in the second black box you can see there, to Gilgal to, quote, renew the monarchy. Well, what does that mean, to renew the monarchy? If Saul has been chosen and he's just successfully led them in battle, which is why they wanted a king in the first place, and he successfully held off a desire for vengeance against those who resisted his own reign, then what needs to be renewed? There doesn't seem to be any dissent. There doesn't seem to be any schism or break that would need to be healed here, other than the small group of people who were refusing Saul. But that doesn't seem to be the focus of what's happening in Samuel's long speech in chapter 12 that we'll look at in detail as we go. Continuing in that black box, we note the narrator says, after Samuel called the people to renew the monarchy, we hear, "And there they made Saul king before Yahweh," as if it hadn't happened before. But it had happened before, or had it? Because when we go back to the question of characters' perspectives on monarchy, and we go back here to the blue section in chapter 10, we hear and recall that Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it on his head, Saul's head, and kissed him and said, "Yahweh has anointed you Nagid," translated here as ruler, but Nagid, or prince, and prince is a misleading translation because in English, American English, but also in English like UK tradition or any European tradition that uses a word like prince, we associate prince with the son of the king. And Saul is not son of the king. It's just using this for some other term than king. And we don't really know, is Nagid meant to be lesser than king? Why was Saul anointed as a Nagid if the people wanted a Melech, a king? And then, as you can also see in that blue box there at the end, Samuel continues, "Now this shall be the sign to you that Yahweh has anointed you Kyrios," in the Greek at least, Lord, over his heritage. So different questions of title there. But here we are seeing in chapter 12 that they're suggesting they're making Saul king for the first time. That leads some scholars to wonder about sources and different voices, but whoever edited it together didn't mind having these multiple perspectives in one place. And then Sam gives an incredibly long speech. It's the entire chapter of 12, and it includes a nasty attempt at divine approval, where to get the people to believe that Yahweh is on his side, he calls upon Yahweh to destroy the wheat crop during the harvest by a thunderstorm, and it happens. And the people, of course, are terrified at that. But Samuel calls down destruction on the life force of his own people in order to make a point. Is that something we're supposed to be approving of? And why has Yahweh gone along with that? In the end, the people submit to Samuel, acknowledge their sins, and demanding a king, which one might think would lead to, okay, let's not have a king. Let's repent from our sins and not have a king. But that's not at all what happens. Instead, what happens is Saul goes on picking an army some more. Notice just a quote here on the left side from that chapter 12 that I want to bring in perspective. Here, from Samuel's perspective, notice in 12:12 it says, "When you saw that King Nahash of the Ammonites came against you, you said, 'No, but a king shall reign over us.'" But that's not what happened at all. It was about the Philistines. King Nahash doesn't happen until right here, as we see, although the Ammonites have long been a part of it. Samuel's role in all this is very confusing. It may even be confusing to Samuel himself, as we'll see. Eventually, as we'll see him crying out angrily to Yahweh all night in a poignant scene that we'll come to. So, continuing on here to chapter 13. So after this renewal of the kingship and the long speech, Saul continues to reign. There's no repentance. There's no sense of ending the kingship. Notice so far it's not anti-Saul. It's still just a generic question of monarchy. But the chapters 13, 14, and 15 are going to make it personal, are going to make it about Saul. So we see here this reign begins by his choosing 3,000 soldiers, keeping 2,000 and giving 1,000 to Jonathan, who is not named as Saul's son at this point, and we don't know who Jonathan is or why he's splitting up the soldiers between him and Jonathan. But Jonathan manages to defeat the Philistine garrison, and Saul blows the shofar, the trumpet, to have, again, the people join him at Gilgal. And you can see I've highlighted in bold throughout here the different characters that are at issue, so we can see how the dynamics between the individuals on one hand, Saul and Samuel and Jonathan, etc., and Yahweh, play out against the generic response of the people or the elders, etc. At the beginning of chapter 13, it seems successful, but then, as you can see here, that's just the first verses. It continues. The Philistines regroup, and the Israelites find themselves in a tight spot, and Saul is waiting for Samuel, who told him in chapter 10 to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days for me, where I will tell you what to do. Again, that comes after Yahweh will tell you what to do, or do whatever is in your own heart, but wait for me to tell you what to do. A very confusing note there. So Saul is obedient, but Samuel doesn't show up for 7 days, and so Saul begins to offer the burnt offerings. And at that moment, as if he was standing behind a tree, Samuel arrives. And as you can see in the continuing scene in the yellow part, Samuel immediately confronts Saul and charges him with, quote, not keeping the commandments of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. But what commandments are those? Is it a specific commandment to Saul? Are we supposed to understand the commandments, like the commandments that Moses got on the tablets on Mount Sinai, as recorded in Exodus or Deuteronomy? Those aren't cited here. There's no reference to Torah. There's no reference to Moses. No reference to the Exodus or the wilderness or anything of that here, although there was in Samuel's speech in chapter 12. So we have no idea what commandments those are, and scholars have run over themselves every which direction trying to figure out what exactly is going on there. And then Samuel continues to say something also confusing, that as a result, Yahweh is taking the kingdom away from Saul and giving it to a man, quote, after his own heart. Whatever exactly that means, to be after Yahweh's own heart. And scholars have run around all of different directions on that one too, not surprisingly. So then we get a narrative aside here as the narrator tells us that one of the challenges in this social situation is the Philistines control metallurgy. So there's no way you can get blacksmithing done to produce swords and spears or get things sharpened without going to the Philistines, which the Israelites obviously can't do. So it suggests, as we've seen, that the Philistines' metal advantages are their primary advantage, not just in weapons, but in metal-wheeled chariots that can go up over the rocky hillsides and go after crops and things like that, as opposed to wooden-wheeled chariots, which obviously would break down more easily on obstacles. So the preparations are made for battling the Philistines with whatever weapons they might have. And then we move into chapter 14, and suddenly we find that Jonathan is the son of Saul, and he, armed with only one companion as armor-bearer, successfully led an ambush against the Philistines that leads to a panic. And so Jonathan, out of nowhere, with no official authority, and we know nothing about him other than he's the son of the king, is incredibly successful with one other person going out almost single-handedly against the mighty Philistines. And we note there, just in passing, again, we'll come back to this, first time we're seeing a good son. Because at the beginning of 1 Samuel, we saw that Eli, the priest's sons, were corrupt, and Samuel's sons are also corrupt to his own chagrin and perhaps embarrassment, as we'll see. But ironically, Saul, who's rejected by God, his children are not corrupt. His son Jonathan here, and we'll see later in the story, his daughter Michal and other of his family members. So an ironic shift there, that he as a king may be not accepted by Yahweh, but his son is okay, and as we'll see, Jonathan becomes David's best friend. So Jonathan, having accomplished that, now again, like we saw previously, the action shifts to Saul, and he rallies his own troops, but he calls upon Ahijah, who's the grandson of Eli, or who I was just saying, whose sons were corrupt. So this is somebody whose father was a corrupt priest, and now that's who Saul has chosen to carry the ark. It's not a good sign, and we don't know where Ahijah came from, but there he is. And as many scholars have noted, is this a sign of calling upon Yahweh positively, in the sense that Yahweh's leading the battle, or is it a superstitious lack of trust that without doing like a magic trick or some kind of superstitious thing with the ark or the ephod, he couldn't have victory? But as it is, the narrator tells us, Yahweh gave Israel the victory that day. And as the victory is unfolding, they still have to go after the Philistines some more, and Saul lays an oath on his troops not to, quote, eat before it is evening, and I have been avenged on my enemies. But Jonathan wasn't there for the oath, and like many stories like this in literature, Jonathan, the beloved son, is going to be the one who Saul finds is the one who violated his oath. But having not known about the oath, when the soldiers are hungry, he finds some honey and tastes it, and he says his eyes were brightened. And when they tell him that his father made this oath, he does not respect his father. In fact, he says, my father has troubled the land. So now we see there's a split between Jonathan and Saul. And after the battle, the troops sweep on the spoil, and Saul is told that they're sinning. Somebody's tattling to the king about violating the rules, and we don't know who that is. And Saul orders them to kill and eat oxen, and then builds an altar to Yahweh, and attempts to seek Yahweh's approval for going after the Philistines, but Yahweh is silent, as Yahweh always is with Saul. Yahweh will never respond to Saul. So we saw that Samuel was speaking with Saul even before Samuel knew Yahweh was there when he was a child and under Eli's protection. And David and Yahweh will have a relationship, but Saul has no direct relationship with Yahweh at all, and we don't know why that is. So he orders a search to find who violated the oath, and by lots, it turns out to be Jonathan, and he's willing to have his son killed in order to keep this foolish oath. But suddenly the people take Jonathan's side against the king, and so Saul gives up on having Jonathan killed and gives up on the battle in the Philistines as well. So by the time we come to the end of chapter 14, we see fracture lines here between not only Saul and Jonathan, but between Saul on the one hand and Jonathan on the other hand, vis-a-vis the people. But Yahweh is not a part of this so far. We don't see that Yahweh has turned on Saul in any way. And then surprisingly, at the end of chapter 14, there's a very positive summary of Saul's military victories, which leads scholars oriented this way to think that's an asserted source piece, or an asserted piece from a source pro-Saul, and it may well be. But putting it there, right after Saul is engaged in this foolish oath and perhaps, certainly risk the life of his son Jonathan, rings a little more hollow. What are military victories from a king who seems that unstable that he'd make such a rash oath that could have his own son killed? And then we come finally to the crux of the matter in chapter 15 here, and that's where I'll bring back the Saul and Samuel relationship document here. I realize this is going a long time, but what if we hadn't done this and you were going directly into the passages? So I'm not going to read this long paragraph here. It's a chapter we'll spend a lot of time on. It's incredibly complicated to sort this out. But what happens here is that Saul, I've made a mistake there, sorry. It should have been Samuel comes to Saul. Saul comes to Samuel, I'm sorry, there in 15, 1-35, and claims Yahweh has ordered the king to attack the Amalekites for what they did during the journey. And so Samuel tells Saul, and as my note says, in words will be parsed like a legal provision, quote, utterly destroy all that they have, do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. One of the things scholars tend to not comment on is the morality of that harem statement, the sense of killing everybody. They seem to take it for granted that's something that's in the tradition, and it is, in what I certainly call, in my sense, the religion of empire traditions, where Yahweh is on the side of destruction. But certainly, readers, I trust then or now, would at least have some qualms about killing man and woman, child and infant, and everything. Why? Why all that death and destruction? Again, certainly people are innocent. It's obviously racial genocide here. But Saul doesn't question the order. He leads the battle. And yet, as we see there in that second paragraph, he took their king Agag alive and, quote, the best of the sheep and of the cattle and of the fatlings and the lambs and all that was valuable and would not utterly destroy them. Just like David will do later and distribute them to his soldiers, as you would expect kings to do, maybe like you expect pirates to do. But in the absence of a government salary to pay for your soldiers, how else are they supposed to be rewarded for risking their lives except getting some of the spoil? A very traditional thing used throughout many cultures. And Saul was going to do this, but Samuel told him not to. And so now Yahweh speaks directly to Samuel and says, I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. But again, we must ask, which commands? Literally, it's not carried out my word, but either way, which word? What of what Yahweh wants Saul to do has he not done? And that's where Samuel cries out angrily to Yahweh all night and rises and comes to Saul, and then he confronts him. And I won't go through the confrontation because this video is already getting long. But Samuel gives him a complex theology which is not featured anywhere else in Samuel or really anywhere else, where he likens rebellion to idolatry. And we don't hear that Saul ever is accused of worshiping other gods, the Baals or the Astartes or the gods of the Philistines, Dagon, or others that we saw early on with the journey of the ark in chapters 4-6 in 1 Samuel. But Samuel equates rebellion, which here means not doing to the letter what Samuel told him to do, behavior that I've just said other kings have done with no criticism from Yahweh or anything else, and that he's a rebellious idolater. And not only that God has rejected him, and that he's a sinner, and leading Saul to beg him for mercy to not be humiliated in front of everybody. And Samuel relents that far, but they never see each other again until after Samuel is dead. And Samuel grieved over Saul, and Yahweh was sorry he'd made Saul king over Israel. So that leads to two final things to just note here as we go through this. Whose voices are we hearing? I won't go through this now, but I just want to draw attention to this, that depending upon the time period we're talking about, we could hear many layers of voices speaking here, and that's part of Ian Wilson's point about history and memory. And then also some of these issues that we looked at the very beginning of the Saul section here, of why is Saul doing some of these things, and how do we sort those out as we go. So I realize this is complex, and as I said a few minutes ago, maybe you're leaving this more confused than clear, but I'm hoping as we begin to look at chapter 11 and go through it in detail, we can remember some of these questions and try to pay close attention to the details that even the best scholars struggle with. So don't feel bad if you need to scratch your head once in a while. See you next time. Bye-bye.